how do I push beyond the solitude of self-study and understand that being a Christian is going to be more about personal study, private study, or meditation, and somehow community. That's in some senses where the rubber meets the road, is how I'm held by community, challenged by community, sometimes maybe butt heads with somebody and have to reconcile and actually put the gospel into practice in community, and so forth. It's a beautiful and vulnerable place for you to be sort of foraying into this question about, okay, what's next? How does this get fostered? One professor I had in graduate school said, we learn to be by being among, which I thought is very beautiful. You know, if you hang around derelicts all your life, you're going to end up derelict. You know, if you hang around, virtuous people, chances are you have a better shot at a virtuous life, and so on. So rather than look at this point for you at the big picture of denominations and their differences, I would look locally. Find a community that speaks to you. I think that we have too brashly assumed that what we now call church division is all bad. I think a lot of it is just diversity. I think people have different ways of coming to God because just the way we're wired or built. And for some, what we call emotion devotion and the hymn singing and the hand waving might be really bring you to a place of real ecstasy. And for others, sitting in silence in a circle and everything in between, high liturgy, low liturgy. So let the journey guide you to a local community first, a place where you feel embraced and welcomed, and where you feel at home with their practices and feel supported as a woman who's deeply moving into the contemplative life and so forth. And you'll start to get, I think, a feel for where am I being summoned, where am I being called, where am I being fed, and allow your heart to guide, rather than think you have to choose and then stick with it. Allow yourself, as I always say, it's all one kingdom. It's the same heart. The question you're asking is which chamber? Yeah. You see? And where am I going to get oxygenated, right, in my daily life? Pursue that. We could have a further conversation more personally, if you'd like, before the weekend's over to give you some guidance on that. But I would say let your heart lead you on the local level. You don't have to read about the international version of these churches, because they differ, right? There are some Episcopal churches I'd rather not attend, and others I'm more called to, even though I'm an Episcopal priest. So I would say start with that local.
I want to talk to you about something that you said very early in your introductory remarks this morning, and that is you see centering prayer on the contemplative train, if you will, as important for the future of the church, for Christianity, for the world. I wonder if you could say more about that, how you see that evolving and how it might be energized. Yeah,
thank you. It's you're asking me about how I want to contemplatively take over the world, right? So as this room exemplifies, the days of sectarian membership are gone. Most people in the pews are less concerned about sticking with their denomination when it comes to my spiritual growth and all than with like-minded folks who are going to support that journey. On the one hand, there will never be a contemplative megachurch. It's hard work. It requires both interpersonal constitution, but also working through other folks in the community in ways that don't allow a community to kind of move into that deleterious place of just being a social club, right? You have to constantly work at that, like a marriage. Complacency can set in. And I also don't think that the contemplative life is the only way that the church will flourish in the future. So I just want to clarify that. But I do think it is a burgeoning, flourishing aspect of the church that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my comments, has yet to be quantified. We don't know how to, because it's not sectarian, because it's not one denomination. There's a beautiful book called A Search for the Meaning of Life by Willigus Jaeger, who recently died, but I have to tell you, like 10 years before he died, I thought he died. So for years I was saying, yeah, but he's dead now. And it turns out, I'm like, wait a minute, he just came out with another book. How is that possible? I felt so bad that I had been telling people for years he was dead. So when he finally died, I'm like, no, for real, he's dead now. So anyway, it's crazy. So, but anyway, he's a beautiful writer. And this book is The Search for the Meaning of Life. He was a German Benedictine. And he has a beautiful chart in that book. And I'll just try to map it for you, sort of in my hands. It's sort of like, if you can picture an arch like this. And then like the way you would have like spokes on an umbrella, like all these coming down. So if you can imagine one, and then you have these umbrella. And then across that arch, he has a horizontal line like this. So there's the spokes are on the bottom, and then it all converges at the top. And what he basically does is each one of those lines in his mind represents not even just a Christian denomination, though you could, but a religion. And what he challenges the reader, everything below that line he calls the exoteric, so the external study of religion. So I go to church and I say my rosary and I do this and I do that and I observe holy days. And then above that line, he says, is the esoteric, what we would call the mystical. And he said, haven't you noticed that no matter which tradition you're from, the farther you move from the externals to the interior life, the less division there seems to be. And if you remove the name Buddha or Jesus or Allah, you wouldn't necessarily know which tradition you're reading, right? And his point is that many of us who are journeying or searching for this more authentic life will have that moment, as I talked earlier, where the sun sets. That is to say, it sets on the exoteric. You say, what am I doing? What does all this really mean? Is there really anything beyond this? And so begins the dark night and the search through. And how often it could feel that we feel closer to people of other traditions who are advancing in their own way through this journey than we do to people who happen to share the same exoteric, right, expression, but aren't going there. Do you feel what I'm saying? So this is what I mean to suggest that it's the future. My sense is that I am not about to turn St. Columba's into an interfaith center. It is squarely and pointedly and unambiguously Christian, but it's Christian in dialogue with the local Green Gulch, which is a Zen center, or the Vedanta retreat, which is down the road, or Spirit Rock, which is sort of a Vipassana center. It's not to conflate, because we don't want to lose the beauty of what Christianity offers to that conversation, which I think is profound. But at the same time, there's a suspicion that there's more than what our sectarian views have gotten us, whether that's denominational or religious. Father Keating, or as you know, Father Thomas Merton, was profoundly forward-thinking. As he died in Thailand talking to Buddhist and Christian monks, right? So he was through an electrocution, by accident, of course. So the work is still to be done, and my sense is that as we're seeing the church's hemorrhage, which we are denominationally, there is this thing that you're all part of that's happening. And I think the time will come where, as is always the case, the church will be governed by the sensus fidelium, the sense of the people, the sense of the faithful. And that what you're doing here, and the seeds you're planting, and the example you're living, and the way you're inviting people into it, and the draw that people have to it, will begin to percolate until there's potentially more of a tipping point. So I don't think there will be a major contemplative revolution, but I do think that as the church shrinks and untethers from Christendom, which is that empire-sponsored form of Christianity, to that, which Constantine introduced, and we have had a complex relationship with empire ever since. We sought it for protection, and yet once the church is in bed with the crown, the radicalism of the gospel is completely undermined. This is what started the contemplative life. This is what made the desert mothers and fathers run, that and tax evasion, but anyway, made them, it really was, it's really true. But it's what made them flee into the desert, because they call themselves the white martyrs. We're not giving our blood anymore, because now Christianity is the state religion, but we're giving our whole lives. We're not dying for Christ, but we're living fully by segregating ourselves from the empire. which had co-opted the very soul of Christianity as much as it preserved it. So once the church is in bed with the crown, you get Christianity being used to justify slavery and colonization and empire annexing and all the horrors we've seen that we have been co-opted into. That we need to untether. The social expectation that you should go to church because you don't want, you wonder what the neighbors are going to think if you don't, as opposed to a smaller, more purified, committed groups like we saw in Paul's time, like we saw in the first few centuries, who are not necessarily being persecuted, praise God, but are in a culture that is somewhat antithetical to the values and to the spiritual life and that we're trying to imbibe. And there's a privileged, beautiful place because of that, there's no complacency. Our communities will become much more intentional. And in that intentionality, I think, is where we'll see the life and the spirit moving through. So it'll have less to do with sectarian commitments and more to do with the shared, commitments across sectarian lines that are committed to the question, what does it mean to be committed to the gospel today? And I think one of the ways we'll really see, as I say vibrantly, is through the contemplative life. There will be others, to be sure. Does that help give you a, yeah.
I'm a student of Howard Thurman's, and he suggests that spiritual experience of God is essential to the understanding of our relatedness to other people and to the rest of creation.
Right.
And he has been criticized by people who suggest that that is a necessary requirement. How would you address the idea that without a contemplative practice, without an experience, a spiritual experience of the connectedness of things, how can we move to true understanding of community?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will be coming to this citation in my comments that I'll give tomorrow, so I'll try to anticipate a bit there. I agree with Thurman that experience is so core. Something that we have to remember is that what is it that people are experiencing when they go to church? And often it isn't something that most people care to go back to, and that's a problem. So what does it mean then to have a community in which, in and through the community, what we call at St. Columba is the beloved community, what does it mean to hold a space of spiritual intimacy, like what we were asking you to do on the Emmaus Walk? What would it mean to have an entire community doing that? It means a lot of things. But how can I say, the movement on the first hand to just fill my pews, as many priests and ministers think, is wrong-headed. What happens at the liturgy is, when that celebration is real, is authentic, is life-giving, it's because of what happens outside the liturgy. It's the relationships that are being forged, the mercy and the grace and the beauty that people encounter, either through my own ministry or through ministering to each other, so that when we come together, there is genuine love and affection, and then the liturgy comes to life. Because of the experience of Christ loving me through another person, because the experience of grace and mercy and forgiveness. So when we do our sign of peace at St. Columba's, it literally could go on for almost 15 minutes. And there was a rather persnickety parishioner who used to be there, operative word, used to be, who challenged me on that and said, the sign of peace is not a coffee clutch. But you see, what she was not understanding is that when two Christians stand and embrace one another in a reconciling love, when they pause to look each other in the eye and say, how is that thing going? When they hold one another with tenderness and compassion, The kingdom of God has literally broken into human history in that moment and could never be erased from the history of the cosmos. It is a moment that will forever be enshrined in our history. A moment when, like that little mustard seed or that little piece of leaven, unseen but at work, growing, it's where it happens. If we do the perfunctory, what is that? Really, what is that? How do we take the mechanisms of liturgy and make them transformational? How do we take the sign of peace and make it transformational? Make it an encounter of Christ, an experience of being loved. So whether we have that experience in our meditation and or through a beloved community, it is essential to what it means to be a Christian in the world, because it's in that experience of being loved that we're drawn to the beauty of it, that we're drawn to the freedom of it. Do you see? So when we meditate, as I'm trying to suggest in the quote that you read here, our culture wants us to see this as a pastime. Oh, that quaint little thing you do. Oh, that nice thing you do when you're alone in your living room. But it isn't, because it's unshackling us from the demands of the false self. With, as Keating would say, it's afflictive emotions and problem and historical problem. So the work is both interior and, as I'll point out tomorrow when I explore this further, exterior. Asceticism, loving our neighbor, essentially, is what it boils down to, is prayer turned inside out. It's exactly the same thing, just socially versus interiorly, and I'll try to spell that out for you tomorrow. But that experience, Thurman is right. It's all about that. It must be, on some level. I know that we are at time, right? Yeah, we're at time. So I want to just thank you tonight for your thoughts and reflections. Quite beautiful.